Chapter 7, Early Adulthood Cognitive Development. So during this section, we will discuss an overview of cognitive development, cognitive milestones in early adulthood, beyond Piaget's theory, and information processing during early adulthood. So let's start with an overview of cognitive development. So cognitive development are the processes such as perception, thinking, reasoning, and problem solving by which one comes to understand the world around them. So let's look at some of the milestones during early adulthood. So during this age, early adulthood age adults their thinking is becoming more practical and dialectical to adapt to their inconsistencies and complexities in their daily experiences. So what that means is that they're able to go with the flow and roll with the punches when things are not going the way that they're supposed to, or when things are out of routine. They're able to problem solve and figure out how to adapt their thinking to go with what's going on in the here and now. During this age, their short-term memory is also peaking. Wisdom and expertise begin to develop. Vocabulary and knowledge continues to grow through their work interactions and their everyday problem solving. And during this age, Piaget's formal operation stage is there, but also neo-Piaget post-formal stage, which is what we're going to talk about coming up with beyond Piaget's fourth stage of development. So let's look at what's beyond Piaget's theory. So some researchers suggest that Piaget should have a fifth stage of development called post-operational thought. And this fifth stage would mean that adults think beyond what adolescents do in the formal operation stage. So they think differently and they go beyond that abstract reasoning that Piaget's theory stops at. So in this stage, adults have what is known as dialectical thinking, which is a style of thinking in which adults, they appeal to accept and contradictions and even conflicts in values. So they're able to really understand different people's points of view, and they're also able to make decisions based on situations and circumstances. So in this case, for instance, you probably were told when you were younger, it's never good to lie. But as an adult, you realize that it sometimes is better to lie based on the circumstance and the situation. So this would be an example of dialectical thinking where the rule doesn't always apply to certain situations and circumstances. It all depends. Now, they're also able to integrate logic and emotion together. So adolescents were feeling a lot of these emotions and things for the first time. So they thought more with their emotion than with their logic. Adults are more able to combine those together. They're also able to think in dialects. So they have these multiple selves. So they have mom and husband or wife or sister or brother. And they're able to think in those different categories, those different performativities of who they are. And they're also able to cognitively handle emotional situations. Now, another perspective is some theorists do not agree with that post-formal thought, that fifth stage. And they say that there's actually an acquisition period, which is a shift in cognition that is seen in children and adolescents, and that this period is believed to lay the foundation for all changes in thinking in adulthood. So those four stages are for children, and they lay the foundation for what is going to be added to it as they get older. So these thinking abilities assist young adults to choose a career in the achieving period. So they've built all this knowledge, and now it's time for them to do something with it. So by making choices in what they want to do in the achieving period, they're gaining autonomy and the freedom and power to think for oneself to make choices and to live with the consequences is also a part of that period of time. And this prepares them to move to the next phase during the middle adult years, which is known as social responsibility. So they're able to contribute to society. And the greatest challenge is to learn to accept the uncertainties of life. So things like ethical decision making, what's right and wrong based off of situations, and how there's multiple answers or pathways. It all depends on weighing out these decisions, assembling the facts, looking at the alternatives, and then making a decision that is best for that situation. So let's pause and process what we have talked about so far. Go back and review as needed to answer these two questions. So let's look at information processing during early adulthood. Now, information processing, like we've talked about, is this computer model. It's the sensory information that's coming in, and we either put it in our short-term memory, which is then moved into our working memory, or we forget it. And then if we need it and we move our short-term into our working memory, we either forget it or rehearse it, or we put it into our long-term memory. It's the way we process information. Now, in early adulthood, this is where information processing peaks. Our attention skills are strong, our memory is robust, our metacognitive skills are solid, and our language skills are fully developed. So we're able to make connections that we weren't necessarily able to make as children and adolescents. Now, cognitive style does play a big factor in our information processing ability. And cognitive style is the intellectual aspect of learning that helps us to perceive, organize, and evaluate information. So learning is best when it's presented in a person's cognitive style, or some of us have heard of this as our learning style. And all of us learn a little bit different. Some of us need to see it, some of us need to hear it, some of us need to write it down, and some of us need to actually do the activity so that we can remember it. So the cognitive styles are visual, auditory, kinesthetic, global or relational, which is meaningful context, or analytical. And there's a lot of different ones depending on what research you read. So for instance, visual learners need to see it. So they would more out want to see a graph or a chart like I'm showing you right now. Whereas an auditory learner would use verbalization. So they would want me to explain this as they look at it as well. And then also as maybe they write down notes. And like I said, a lot of these go together. And then kinesthetics, those are the ones who really want to be able to do and demonstrate. And I use a variety of these throughout my class. I show you visuals. I add to it by giving you an oral explanation. I show you videos. And then when you go into your virtual field experience, I actually have you demonstrating what we're talking about when you're viewing. So motivation and learning are also two things that are important in information processing. And motivation affects the amount of time that people are willing to devote to learning. So people have to be motivated to want to learn. If they're not motivated, then they're not going to want to do it. And environments that promote motivation for learning have the following things. They have material and assignments that are appropriate for the level of knowledge and the level of the learner. They also incorporate social opportunities, and the learner can see the usefulness in the application of the material they are being asked to learn. So something that you may have noticed in my class, especially as we're going throughout these presentations, anytime we stop and we process, everything we just covered is in the questions. That is to motivate you to pay attention to certain segments and to be able to chunk it so that when you get to that section, you can really answer those questions. And then when you get to the virtual field experience, it's having you to apply all of it. It's trying to create that environment to where you can see, oh, what she's talking about is going to be important for me to know. And I'm going to have to constantly go back and review certain things so that I am capable of doing a good job on my virtual field experience. Or I really need to pay attention to these key concepts that she's talking about so that I can do well on my stop and process section. Now, there's two types of motivation. Now, for some of you, it may be intrinsic, and for some of you, it may be extrinsic. Intrinsic means that it's on the inside. So, intrinsic, whenever I think about that, inside. And this is when you engage in a behavior that is personally rewarding to you. There's not an external reward. So, you're doing it because you enjoy it, you want to do it. Extrinsic motivation, that's on the X side. I always think about an X, and you want your X to be far, far away from you. So that's the stuff that's on the outside. And it's a behavior that is driven by those outside rewards, such as money, fame, grades, and praise. Now, some of you may have an intrinsic and an extrinsic motivation. So you may want a good grade in this class, but maybe you want to work with children or with people later. So you have an intrinsic and an extrinsic motivation. So it all kind of depends. So it can be a combination of both, or it can be heavier on one than the other. So self-regulated learning. Self-regulated learning is when a person keeps track of what they've learned. They know what they still need to learn, and they have a strategy for how they're going to learn it. And there's 4 phases of self-regulation. There's the planning phase, and this is where you set a goal. And you consider, this is what I know, this is what I need to know. Some of you, when you take notes, you may put a star or a question mark beside something because you know you need to go back and look at it. Or you may do that with the questions at the end of these sections. You may go, okay, I know these answers, but I need to go back and look for question 2 and 3. That would be part of the planning phase. You know what you know, and you know what you need to go back and look for. Monitoring phase, this is when you're maintaining an awareness of what is being learned and thinking. So some of you may be writing notes, and you are maintaining awareness of what's going on. Or you may go back and look at your notes repeatedly as you're doing other assignments or when you're doing a certain task. The control phase is the period where you make changes and or adaptations to the approach of learning. So for instance, throughout this class, as you started doing more and more virtual field experiences, you may, in the control phase, go, I need to pay more attention to the theorist she talks about. So I'm going to take really good notes on the theorist, so when I go to my virtual field experience, I'm able to answer those questions more thoroughly and in more detail so that I get on my point, or so that I learn the content better, depending on if you're intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. Then in the reflection phase, this is when you judge your work and you make attributions in regard to the quality of the work, and you evaluate your outcomes. A lot of times in college, the reflection phase comes when you get that grade. And you go, ooh, I got an A, yay, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. Or, ooh, I made a C or a D. I may need to change something because I'm not doing as well as I could be. But all of these are they're an ongoing cycle. So planning, monitoring, control, reflection, back to planning based off of your results in the reflection phase. So like I said, it's this ongoing cycle. So you start with your planning. So when will I start? Where? How? What do I need to do? And then monitoring, am I doing what I need to do to meet my goal? And then control. I'm getting this. I don't think I'm getting this. What should I do to change my actions or to change my study skills? And then reflection is, did I do everything I was supposed to do? Did I do well? Did I do poorly? Was my grade a reflection of what I did? Well, depending on what it is that you did, you may have to go back and change your plan. So if you didn't get the results you wanted, you would go back and change your plan. That's all part of being self-regulated. If you don't change your plan, then you're self-regulating in an ineffective way. So intellectual functioning is another thing that is prevalent in early adulthood. And developmental psychologists suggest that there are 4 areas of intellectual functioning changes in early adulthood: crystallized intelligence, cognitive flexibility, visomotor flexibility, and visualization. Now, fluid intelligence does reach its peak between ages 20 and 30, and it declines in later years. And fluid intelligence is the ability to perceive relationships and reason logically and abstractly and form concepts and interpretations. So, this is dependent on the functioning and the integrity of the nervous system and one's heredity. It's manifested in these biological processes of speed of thinking, problem solving, abilities, and your information recall. So it's very much part of information processing, of how you're processing your information and how quickly you can pull and recall the information that's stored into your long-term and working memory. Now, crystallized intelligence, these are the skills that are acquired through education and socialization, such as verbal skills, math skills, inductive reasoning, and interpersonal skills. The ability to recall and use information. But there's a big difference between fluid and crystal. Fluid is the capacity to reason and the ability to learn new things and to be able to think abstractly and solve problems. Crystallized is based on what you know. So it's prior learning, so it's your prior knowledge and your experiences, and it's based on your facts. Now, this increases with age. Fluid intelligence is more of it's more of biology based. Crystallized is based more on your experiences. So if we look right here, crystallized is education dependent. So it's based on what you learn during your experiences and during school, whereas fluid is more based off of nature, your biology. And it's not dependent on what you learned. It's on your ability to reason and think, not the accumulation of the knowledge you gained throughout your experience. Now, cognitive flexibility, this is the ability to shift one thinking style to another. And there's multiple types of thinking. There's divergent thinking, convergent thinking, lateral thinking, and problem solving. So problem solving is the ability to figure out what the problem is, figure out why the problem is happening, develop a plan, implement the plan, and then evaluate whether it solved the problem or not. So it's very much part of self-regulation as well, and it's still that cycle. Now, divergent thinking, this is where you use different types of thinking. So whenever I think of divergent, I think of different. Divergent's different. So it's when you use your imagination and your creativity to think outside of the box. So here's a question, and then you have all these ideas of what you could do with it. Different ways. So if I asked you what are the uses of a brick, you could say, well, it could be a doorstop, it could be a flower pot, it could hold up a wobbly table. There's lots of things it could be used for. Now, convergent thinking, on the other hand, this is where you converge, means to come together. So it's where you pull from different things in your toolbox to solve a problem. So this would be where you pull facts to answer your question. So if I asked you to solve a question that uses the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, you would have to pull your factual knowledge of, well, what's a what's A, what's B, what's C. And then you would have to know how to do square roots. You would have to know how to add. You would have to have number sense. You would have to know what an equal mark is. You would have to know how to take the square root at the end. You would have to pull your logic from all these different places. Now, lateral thinking is when you use both of these. You use divergent thinking and convergent thinking to think outside of the box. So you use your logic to use your imagination. And there's a time and a place for all three different types of thinking here, and also problem solving. Now, videomotor flexibility, this is the ability to shift from familiar to unfamiliar tasks involving hand-eye coordination. So an example of this would be using touch screens to move objects for the first time. So to move real objects, our hands need to get in direct physical contact with the object. But when you do this on a screen, it's different. Instead of grabbing the object, you just use your finger. So it would be taking your logic from one thing and trying to apply it to a completely different context. So if any of you have ever used a coloring book before, so you would open up your coloring book, you would pick up your colored pencils, and you would color it on in between the lines on the paper. Well, if you do coloring on a tablet, you never pick up the objects. Instead, you have the screen in front of you, and you would select the color, and then you would just hit on the place, and it would color it in, or you would use your finger to color it in, which is taking a similar concept with something you've never done before and putting it together. And then visualization. Visualization is the ability to organize and process visual materials. And there's two types of visualization. There's spatial visualization and object visualization. Now, spatial visualization is the ability to process visual information about spatial relations between objects or their parts and perform mental transformations and manipulations. Now, when you were in school, you were probably given things like this and said, here's your object. What is the rotation or the inverse or the transverse of it? And you had to flip it in your mind. That would be an example of a spatial visualization. Or it would say, which two parts could be put together to make a whole? And then you would have to visually, in your head, put those together. So it's the ability to mentally manipulate objects from a stationary point of view, but in your head you have that object and you're twisting it and turning it without actually having it in your hands. Now, object visualization, on the other hand, this is the ability to process visual information about appearances of objects and scenes in terms of pictorial properties. So this would be the ability to interpret a pie chart or a graph or any type of map, understanding the differences in the colors or the different variations of the shades of color to show elevation. That would be an object visualization. So language and communication. Now there's little research on early adulthood language development, but what research does do is it focuses on the aspects of adult speech and behavior that promote language development in children. So what it says is that the amount of language that a child hears is important. So what an adult says to them will impact the child. Also, what the adult says is also important. So making sure that they're asking questions and on topics that will interest the child is also important. And then having those cooperative interactions so that they're talking back and forth about how people feel and how it affects, and using that language back and forth. So the adult is more helping the child than the child is helping the adult, but depending on the topic, the child may know more about it than the adult does. So the adult may in turn learn language from the child and vice versa. So in adulthood, something that does start to become more prevalent is communication via text messaging. Now, older adults and teenagers are known as the net generation. And this just means that they're more internet based and they're going to use internet capability or mobile capabilities to communicate with each other. Now, people text message for various reasons, and they use it for positive and negative communication purposes. Now, positives would be for friendship maintenance. That is one of the most frequent uses of text messaging. And this is where they just use it for social exchanges as opposed of exchanging necessary information. So they'll say things like, "How are you doing? I was thinking about you," instead of, "Can you pick up milk from the grocery store?" or "What time are you coming home?" So they use it for many different reasons, but maintaining friendships that they may not have been capable of doing without the device. Now, negatives of this type of communication are ostracizing someone. So it's a use of social control used to enforce group rules and conformity to behavior. And it can be used as a way of ignoring or rejecting someone. So you may not be included in the group message, or they may message you separate. Also, sexting is still something that is occurring in early adulthood. And it's just when someone sends sexually explicit messages, videos, or photos. And that could be a negative too, because like we talked about in adolescence, once you send it, it's out there for everyone. Anyone on the web can see it. That digital footprint is a thing. And then lastly, miscommunications due to the lack of text etiquette and context. It is hard to read the emotions and the intent of someone in a text. So if you look over here to the side right here, this would be an example of this. "I'm here for you. Thanks, I'm going through a tough time, so it means a lot. And sorry, I lost all my contacts. Who is this? This is your Uber driver. I'm here to pick you up." So the person on the other end thought that it was someone who was asking about them, saying, "I'm here for you if you need to talk," but it was really just the Uber driver. Now, that happens a lot because if you don't know who it is, or if you don't know the intent behind what they're saying, it could have been somebody saying, "I'm here to pick you up," but they could have misconstrued it. And sometimes people will say, "Well, your text sounded angry." Well, it kind of depends, especially if you don't know text etiquette and you're using lots of exclamation marks and caps. There's a big difference between that. But you can't understand that through a text. You have to be careful. Now, communication via social networking is very similar to using text messaging. Now, research here focuses on how and why we interact with each other and how technology alters this this interaction through technology. So, social media users, they use it. The common uses are to form and persuade opinions, market products or services, influence the reputation of people or companies, and provide a forum for groups to meet and share information. Now, social media has a lot of great qualities. However, we have to be very careful of what we see because we have to be able to weigh whether it's true or false because it's used to form and persuade opinions. And just because you saw it on social media doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And then also what we look at also gets put into our feeds. So if you are looking at cars, you may notice in your social media that the products and the services that are now there are all about cars or all about beauty or clothes or whatever it is that you last looked at. So they really use this as a way of communicating and using subliminal to a way because you search for something and now it's in there for you. Now, also the uses are very similar when it comes to text messaging. So staying in contact with friends that are far away, but also the negatives when it comes to ostracizing, not having friends on social media, bullying. There's all sorts of negatives to it as well. So, some pros and cons of communication in regard to social networking. Well, some positives of this is the use of a buddy list can allow people to estimate how popular they are. However, on the negative side, the use of a buddy list can also increase feelings of exclusion and to estimate how unpopular they are. A positive would be that it creates a sense of cohesion and identity. Well, on the opposite, it can ostracize people. But if we go back up to the positive, it can also decrease one's sense of isolation. So it can keep them connected, but as a negative, it can also hurt someone. Positives also, it can provide entertainment, and the ads are influenced by what you search, like I said earlier. And negatives, again, ostracizing, sexting, miscommunications, that digital footprint. And then again, the ads are influenced by what you search online. So all of those can be seen as positive and negatives in regard to communicating and using social networking as an adult. So, general internet communication. Now, personality does appear to have some relationship with online communication. People that are extroverted spend more time online and emailing than introverted individuals. And the higher an individual is in regard to their emotional instability and anxiety, the less time they spend online, especially if they don't feel like they belong. Cognitive style also appears to be related to online usage. So if you're a visual learner, you may spend less time online, but if you're a global relational type of person, you may spend more time online because you're trying to stay connected with a lot of people. Demographics also appear to be related to online communication. So ethnicity, marital status, socioeconomic status also play a role in who uses and who doesn't use internet to communicate. So let's pause and process again what we have covered so far. So go back and review as needed to address these questions. And that is the end of this section.